Hi, welcome to the build. It's Friday. I think I've now got all the parts, or the main parts anyway, that I need to start my build. I'm still left with a few dilemmas and a few questions though, and I haven't quite made decisions yet as to how I'm going to deal with them. So I'll talk you through some options. The first of all, the body of my console is of course going to be the SNES controller. I bought a replica one which was USB. I've already been at it and taken the USB lead off. But I think it's a good size, good comfortable size. Everybody's familiar with it. It's well known and it's light, it's small, it's good. I can definitely fit that in a pocket without any issue. I mean, if you compare the size of that to my phone, it's comparable. My first instinct was to not add a screen at all. Now that gave a couple of advantages. First of all, it didn't add to the power draw, so the battery was only going to be powering the internals and it'd last a lot longer. And use a phone, not dissimilarly from how some drones work, where you have to have your phone tethered to the controller. And it'd be something like that kind of configuration. It feels good, it's good size. How often are you going to be out without your phone? I felt like it could work, but also felt like it was a bit of a cop-out for the challenge, because being an electronics challenge, using software to run something along the lines of VNC to get the screen on the phone just wasn't really in the spirit of the challenge. Now, the other option I've got is a little direct-driven screen, just like Ben's original model. Now, again, the size of it's really good. I don't know how clearly you'll see this. It's just maybe 4mm, 2mm each side, smaller than the controller, just right for having a bespoke case 3D printed for it. And again, if we can camshell this so it folds out and sits just above the controller, it's a really nice size, really good control. Would fold up to something just like that. Now, the first issue I have is this input-output header. Now, that's got to go, which means at the very least, I've got to desolder it and get it directly wired. Now, for most of you guys, I'm guessing that sounds fairly easy. For me, that's a challenge. I've got a floppy ribbon, which is more than enough cables for it. But first thing I've got to do is separate, don't know how clearly you'll see this, the actual screen sits on the back of PCB that's just sort of stuck on with this GPIO header, which is soldered through that board. So I'm going to have to separate the two without breaking the screen, and then see if I can desolder it. The next issue I kind of have is with power. Obviously, the thickness of this doesn't give me a lot to work with. I've got a couple of flat 3.7 cells upstairs which could be used. I'm also aware that if I 3D print a new back to this and give it a slight bulge, I can probably get some 18650 cells in it, which would work. I've got a charging controller which I will use, assuming it all fits, with the external micro USB available to charge and power the device if it wants to run it plugged in. Okay, so I'm back. I'm just about to try and make a breadboard, but while I'm at it, I'm also going to have a look at, and while the soldering iron's out, I'm just going to have a look at a few other things, because while I was having a play and a look with the SNES controller, I did notice that, not my soldering work, I hasten to add, the crystal is soldered, well, it looks like it is soldered about as well as I did it. I'm going to use the trusty phone with the old clip-on macro lens to try and show you. Yeah, here we go. Now that is one of the legs on the crystal. In fact, the other leg doesn't look too smart either. There's barely any solder on that at all. So we're going to reflow that, resolder that before we try and do the breadboard. And then I get the nice fun activity of soldering all of the terminals onto the Raspberry Pi Zero to see if we can get the screen driven through it. Now, I've got an old floppy cable here which will be sacrificing itself for the activity. It's a lot of pins. I'll catch up with you soon. Hi. Since I last spoke to you guys, or since I last did a session, I had a little bit of a disaster. I started on the first night trying to work on the breadboard, pulling together the ribbon cable, and it's horrible. It was solid core, and I'm going for flexibility in my design, and knowing that solid core will break after a few flexes, and the fact the attempt to flex it enough to solder it into position didn't go particularly well either. I had to rethink. So I spent the first day trying, failing, and sourcing some new cable. Then on the second night, I got as far as starting to solder the header onto the Raspberry Pi, which I did with reasonable success. Tiny soldering is not exactly my favourite thing, and but yeah, it's come out reasonably well. Unfortunately, as I desoldered the original connector on the back of the screen, my soldering iron died, which put me back yet another day. So I've had to go out today, buy a new soldering iron, which has enabled me today to finish everything off. So now I think is the time to power it all up for the first time and see how much of it works, or whether it all goes up in a puff of smoke, which with a lithium polymer battery I'm not too keen on. We'll see. The idea of doing a breadboard is purely to make sure that everything connects up and works the way I want it to before I worry about how it's going to fit into a package with any bells and whistles, because if the core doesn't work, there's no point in proceeding. So with the screen now attached to the Raspberry Pi, I've got my battery charging circuit attached to a battery, still not sure if it's the one I'm going to use, and the controller rewired to a micro USB port. Still undecided whether I'm going to go for a matrix or not, but this is the easiest way to get it right powered up and testing. So the first thing to do is going to be plug in the power, see if it goes. Wish me luck, and I'm sorry if I wince. It's got to be a good sign. Power's on, screen has come on white, which it does before the software is installed. And I've got an activity light on the Raspberry Pi. So, touch wood, so far so good. At this point, I can show you that if I plug it all in, it all works. This was not a small moment for me. The first time I managed to get it all wired up and the screen working, I literally stood up and yelled. I'm very proud of this, even to get it this far. I'm very pleased with. I was having issues. As it turns out, it's very important that you check that you're using the right wiring diagram for the device that you have. If you use the wrong wiring diagram, it won't work. Not surprisingly, learned the lesson there. And even once I had it all soldered up correctly, I was still having very big issues and it would not work. I got power to the screen, I got pretty much everything I could think of tested through. I was even testing from the GPIO output pins on the Raspberry Pi right through to the pins on the microcontrollers on the board to make sure I had a solid connection there. The only thing I wasn't actually able to test, and proved to be the downfall, was testing from the microcontroller on the Raspberry Pi. Had I been able to do that, I would have realised that I hadn't fully soldered one of the signal cables. I think it's pin 20 or 18, one or the other. As it turns out, and you guys will probably think this is really obvious and it's something you guys know, new to me, so I thought I'd share the experience. As it turns out, those little copper rings on the Raspberry Pi top and bottom, although for the most part they seem to be connected, not all the traces are double-sided, and certainly not for parts that aren't ground. So what I'd done is soldered it from, in this case, the underside of the PCB, and not managed to get the solder to flow all the way around to attach the cable to the top side of the PCB where the trace actually terminated. But sussed it out, got it soldered, really easy fix. I was beginning to worry that I'd damaged the screen, as I'd been advised in the forums that that was a likely issue, but fortunately it all works. Now that I've got my breadboard completed and I've got a proof of concept and I've got something which I know, or at least have a reasonably good idea that once it all fits together it'll work, I now need to spend some time coming up with the final design of an internal layout of how this is all going to fit into, hopefully, my SNES controller and a little camshell over the top. Well, the 3D printer was running for a good couple of hours yesterday, and I finally got the bits printed out, or at least my first attempt at the pieces printed out. Now, I only got my 3D printer about 6 weeks ago, so I'm still very much experimenting with it and learning how it works and learning how to model properly for it. The parts themselves have come out okay. You got the back half of the screen holder, the front half of the screen holder. They had to be printed in 2 halves, so you actually had a way to get it in with cable routing. The idea being that this is going to glue in the front, place the screen assembly in, glue the front on. Got this hinge section which fixes to the controller. We'll clip in with those ball joints, which I need to sand off and shape up to make sure they're going to fit smoothly. And that should give me a cable route, but I've also tried to include some cable protection so that the single-stranded cables aren't exposed. This is quite a fiddly job as it is, without the glue gun leaving strings all over the place and wanting to fall over. If only there was some sort of high-tech, super capable glue gun available. Unfortunately, during the assembly of the controller, I had a little accident with one of the hinge pieces here. Now, I did go from my first version to my second version, making the hinge detail a lot smaller and neater. I was hoping that it was going to just be a little bit easier to work with, make it easier to assemble. Unfortunately, I made it so light and nimble that it broke. So instead of going back and printing this whole top part again, the whole screen hinge, I've just quickly modelled these tiny little hinges, which essentially can insert into the original hinge, which is already superglued to the controller, so I can't change that. But hopefully they will give me enough strength and rigidity to replace the bits that are broken off. To make all this fit in the case, I've taken the crystal off the back of the USB controller PCB and moved it around to the front. Now, like an idiot, I didn't test it before I assembled it all again. That was a shock to everybody. But my first culprit, sorry it's not in focus, it's that ground connection on the controller. It's looking a bit questionable, so I'll start by working on that and see if that does it. Due to some of the things that I hadn't predicted at the beginning of the project, specifically pointing at GPIO 18 being needed to run the screen, so I couldn't use it for an internal audio connection without using a load of space, so I'm going to have to use the HDMI to VGA adapter. I'm having to shunt my battery to be external. Now, originally I was always going to use this 18650, but I don't have the space, so I'm having to improvise. Now, what I've come up with is having an external battery mount on the back, but as a compromise for the smaller capacity and size of the batteries, I'm going to go for something removable. So I've got 3 of these cells, and the idea being that when one dies, you can just plug the next one in, and away you go. One of the key things that I wanted to do when I started out this project was to better myself, to learn from it, and I've definitely done that. Simply, this is the first time I've used a screen with a Raspberry Pi that is an HDMI. I've improved my soldering skills, I've improved my understandings of the electronics in the controller as well. I've definitely spent more time with my 3D print. The quality of the prints, the way that they work, my understanding of how to use support material best, the way that I've approached the project, that's been an interesting learning curve in itself. If I was going to do another project or start again, I'd spend a lot more time planning. I definitely want to spend more time getting parts, more time researching the parts, when they're going to arrive, what they're going to look like, and have a firmer plan. It's okay to be flexible, but I think my plan was a bit too loose when I started, so it'd be good to see something better next time, I think.